So an article regarding the Carolina Hurricanes and the Chicago Wolves split has been published, and it's generated a lot of discussions, and I'd like to put my 2 cents in. Hey everybody, so I did a little bit of research on this. I didn't dig up much of anything. As far as I can tell, this is the most in-depth story about the Hurricanes and the Wolves splitting and everything like that. Now, this is not me trying to attack Tony Androckitis on a personal level, at least not yet. There's the potential for that to happen. But I will say this, I've read over this article a couple of times. I actually started to read it in the manner that I'm going to now, where I'm talking to y'all about it while I'm reading it and reviewing some of the stuff in it, and I decided to do a take 2 for 2 reasons. One, I didn't really like how I was summarizing what I was seeing the first time. I wanted to make it abundantly clear, while I didn't like a lot of the things said in this article, I'm also not definitively saying that any of this is true or not true, even though it does come off as kind of a hit piece to me. And the second thing being, I got this really awesome microphone boom now, so now I'm starting to look like I'm actually somewhat of a legitimate, like, YouTuber, podcaster guy, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to read the article first. I took some notes when I read it earlier this afternoon, and I'm going to share those notes with you guys and some of the points that I'd like to discuss in regards to my interpretation of the article and kind of my whole overall interpretation of the situation now that this entire thing has kind of started coming to light, and we'll see if more details start emerging about it. But this particular article, at best, does not tell the entire story. Okay, so first things I'm going to highlight here. I've never actually heard of this website. Full disclaimer, I follow the American Hockey League. I follow it less since the Hurricanes aren't affiliated with Charlotte anymore. I followed it a lot more back when the Hurricanes were kind of at the cusp of ending the drought, because I was hoping that some of those prospects would finally put the Hurricanes over the edge, and ultimately a couple of them did help. I very closely followed Jacob Slavin and Brett Pesce's careers while they were in Charlotte. Brock McGinn, Victor Rask, guys like that. But full disclaimer, the AHL is not a league I follow a ton. The vast majority of where I spend my time focusing with hockey is the NHL and the SPHL. So I'm learning some stuff along the way about the nuances between an NHL team and an AHL team. Just kind of saw, okay, this guy got called up, this guy got sent down, this guy is a full-time AHL player who's probably not going to crack the lineup of the show, so he went somewhere for a bigger payday, all that type of stuff. So like I said, I've been learning some stuff along the way as I go here. As I said before, I've got some of my own notes here that I'm going to go over that I took where I have some questions regarding some of the reporting in this article, in this tumultuous relationship between the Hurricanes and the Wolves. Now, a little bit of backstory. The reason why the Hurricanes are affiliated with the Chicago Wolves, Dundon and the owner of the Checkers apparently don't get along. I don't know what all the ins and outs and nuances of that are, but apparently they absolutely do not like each other. They didn't see eye to eye on things, particularly financially, and the Hurricanes switched over to the Chicago Wolves for the sake of, as a cost-saving measure. In a lot of ways, that did work out for the better, considering the events of 2020 and 2021. Definitely contributed to Seth Jarvis maybe getting fast-tracked to the NHL, but that's a different video entirely. All right, so this website, InsideAHLHockey.com, I haven't really read anything on it, but I definitely see this guy, Tony Androckitis, the guy who wrote this article. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. His name's all over it, so I don't know if it's his website or not. But we're going to go over this whole thing here. Okay, let's get into reading the article here. All right, so 26 August 2023, so it's only been 3 days. All right, so it says, editor's note, surprised by the severe lack of reporting on the Carolina Hurricanes and Chicago Wolves breakup, which has resulted in the first American Hockey League team to go without an NHL partner in almost 30 years, as well as leaving the Hurricanes without an AHL home to place their prospects in North America. Inside AHLHockey.com went straight to the source for details about what went wrong between Carolina and AHL Chicago, a behind-the-scenes look at first independent AHL team, and much more. Introducing the first part of in a mini-series on the 2023-24 Chicago Wolves, the Lone Wolves coming from an exclusive one-on-one interview with Wolves GM Wendell Young. That was who was pictured above. All the normal please contribute type of stuff. All right. So the decision to go rogue wasn't made overnight and wasn't one made lightly by Chicago Wolves general manager Wendell Young. If you ask him, he'll tell you it was more about Carolina's actions forcing the Wolves to this move to go fully independent in 2023-24. GM and all of hockey this summer took some time to go one-on-one with InsideAHLHockey.com for a peek behind the scenes of what led to the AHL Chicago and Carolina breakup. Things didn't start off terribly for the Chicago Wolves-Carolina Hurricanes partnership. They did win the Calder Cup as AHL champions in 2022. Keep that in mind. That's going to be relevant to one of my points later, along with the 2019 Calder Cup that the Charlotte Checkers won. But even though the Wolves won the 2022 Calder Cup with the Carolina affiliation, it was one with plenty of turmoil along the way, including at one point, according to Young, Carolina threatening to fire the team's then head coach Ryan Warsofsky during the 2022 Calder Cup Finals if he continued to play goaltender Alex Lyon over Hurricanes prospect goalie Pyotr Kochekov. So I did take the time to look at the numbers between Kochekov and Alex Lyon around that time. From what I can tell, Alex Lyon got on a hot streak, but Pyotr Kochekov was having the more consistent season overall, and he maybe just hit a little bit of a rough patch. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Warsofsky left the Carolina organization after winning the 2022 Calder Cup, joining the San Jose Sharks as NHL assistant coach that offseason. Okay, so that makes sense. A guy just won a Calder Cup, and apparently with his hands tied, as you just described. So, I mean, that definitely proves a lot of coaching competency. I can see why he would get looked at to be behind the bench in the NHL, or an NHL team offers him something in the front office, a scouting job, a player development job, something that could maybe potentially be a pipeline for him to get behind the bench eventually down the line and be an NHL head coach. The year we won, which was 2022, we were super competitive and everything fell into place, Young said. The next year, 2023, totally different philosophy. So here's where this article is already kind of contradicting itself. The guy writing it just said that it was a tumultuous relationship, that it was one with plenty of turmoil already in 2022, yet the guy he's interviewing, his source here, is saying the year they won in 2022, everything was fine, and then the philosophy changed in 2023, so he contradicted himself in the first few paragraphs here. So then let's see the next thing here. The philosophical change from Carolina, which Young refers to as only prospects, only development, did not fall in line with the Wolves' interest of being competitive in the AHL. All right. So, I grew up watching a ton of minor league hockey. I was there for the 4 charter teams of the SPHL, and what preceded it as far as the ACHL and the SEHL came, and that happened a lot where, a guy would be there, he'd get called up, he might be gone for a weekend, you might never see him again, and maintaining a competitive hockey team in the minor leagues is very hard. Your best players are constantly getting plucked to go to the next level. A lot of people have even described minor league sports in general as quote-unquote failing upwards. I don't think that that's a fair way to describe it, but I can definitely see how it frustrates a front office to be constantly losing their best players to being called up. Our coach was told, don't worry about winning this year. Young told InsideAHLHockey.com Monday, referring to Carolina's brass, telling then head coach Brock Sheehan heading into the 2022-23 season to focus solely on developing the organization's top prospects. Okay, so this I find kind of weird. The American Hockey League has been basically the development league for the NHL for a very long time. Now, as stated in the beginning of the article, and this was one thing that was accurate, it's been almost 30 years since the last time that there was an independent American Hockey League franchise. That was the 1994 Worcester Ice Cats. I actually had to look it up because I didn't know. So I think that you kind of go into the American Hockey League with the expectation that it is a development league. It is the best development league that there is, but it is still a development league. And if this is what Chicago wants, if they want to be competitive at the AHL level, then this was probably the best thing that they could do for themselves. At least that's what it looks like on the surface level, but I have more about that I'm going to get to in a few minutes. The other thing here that's weird with me, though, them telling them, hey, don't worry about winning this year, just develop the prospects, that seems kind of contradictory to me. So to put it in other terms, saying, hey, just develop the prospects, but don't worry about winning, that's kind of like saying, hey, learn how to shoot the puck, but don't worry about hitting the net, or telling a baseball player, hey, step up to the plate, but don't worry about hitting home runs, just try and get base hits, or telling a guy driving a race car, hey, make it as fast as possible, but don't worry about winning. That none of that makes any sense to me. Also, in addition to that philosophy, you don't want to throw your young prospects to the fire and them lose any more than they actually have to. You want them to be as competitive as possible right out of the gate. If you want a relatively recent example of that within the Hurricanes organization, look up Jack LaFontaine's first game as a Hurricane. It wasn't pretty, and he has not had consistent starts above the AHL level ever since. Last I saw of him, I think he was actually playing in the E. So the biggest thing about this that doesn't make sense to me, and I know goalies have a little bit less streamlined of a process normally when it comes to their development versus players and everything like that, but you want your prospects playing competitive hockey. If they're out there just getting beaten badly every night because you're giving young guys with no experience all the minutes, and they're not able to learn as much from the older guys who may be career AHL players and everything like that, you're stunting their development. So that makes absolutely no sense to me. Our coach was being dictated on who to play in goal, Young explained to InsideAHLHockey.com. Lineups had to go through Carolina. So I don't know how irregular that is when compared to other NHL franchises. I don't know how much other franchises dictate stuff like that. This is, like I said, this is the deepest look I've ever taken at the dynamic between an NHL and an AHL franchise. But Ryan was on Carolina's payroll. They did hire him. Most of the players on the Wolves were under contract with the Hurricanes. That's going to be a point that I'm going to make later, so keep that in mind as well. Young explained that attempts to improve the roster via trades, loans at the AHL level were repeatedly struck down by Carolina. We were trying to correct it all year. We didn't sign up for this, Young told InsideAHLHockey.com. We didn't sign up to not be competitive. I understand wanting to be competitive and everything like that. Carolina was well aware of the Wolves' intentions to go fully independent for the 2023-24 season well before Young's chain email to agents in early April became public knowledge. Young told InsideAHLHockey.com that despite their many disagreements, he still communicated his team's intentions that if things didn't change, they would be heading in the direction of doing things on their own without an NHL partnership. The Wolves GM also said he worked with Bill Daly and the NHL trying to broker some sort of resolution with Carolina, but after 6 weeks without any progress, Daly concluded Young a resolution couldn't be made between the two sides. So as much as I dislike Gary Bettman, I'll be straight with you guys, I think Bill Daly's worse. That whole situation when he fined Tortorella and basically wrote a letter saying, you know, Tortorella hurt my feelings, I'm going to take some of his money, I don't like him. I really don't. I think that when it comes to finding an arbitrator, I think they would have been better off finding a traffic cone to do it for him. Bill Daly never came off to me as anybody capable of brokering any sort of good negotiation, especially in a, you know, tumultuous relationship like the one described here. Despite breaking off and going their separate ways without an affiliation agreement, Young said he was still in talks with Carolina and would take on some of their players. Okay, so this is where this starts to make even less sense to me. They're saying they're willing to take on some of the Carolina players, but it seemed like the Carolina prospects that were on their roster were being prioritized over career AHL guys. That seems kind of contradictory of what he was saying earlier about how he wants to be competitive, but he'll take on some of the players. But were these players counterintuitive to his attempts to make the Wolves competitive? That's what doesn't make any sense here. But Carolina pulled the plug on the idea, and at the time of the story being published, remained without any AHL affiliation agreement or arrangement for any of their players at the AHL level. They have already loaned several players overseas for the 23-24 season. So that's not irregular. Couple of examples. Aho, he played 1 year in Karpat. He already had a commitment to play there, and that's his dad's team as well, by the way. He had a commitment to play in Karpat already, even though he probably could have played in the NHL on day one, and he finished that commitment up and then came over here, and he could have been assigned to the American Hockey League. Martin Necas went back and played in Czech Extraliga for a season, won a championship, and then came over to play with the Charlotte Checkers. European guys going back to Europe to play is not anything irregular, especially if they're earlier on in their career and you might have a little bit of a log jam in the system and everything like that. Sending those guys back to Europe to play so that they can keep playing, keep developing, keep growing, getting bigger, stronger, enhancing their respective skills and everything like that before they come over to North America and get used to the smaller ice. That's not a very irregular thing. The vast majority of the Hurricanes prospects are either overseas or in the collegiate system, especially their top ones. Nikishin is in the KHL. Felix Unger-Sorm is playing over in the Swedish Hockey League this coming season. Bradley Nadeau is a collegiate player. Scott Morrow, collegiate player. Most of their big prospects weren't even going to be playing at the AHL level anytime soon anyway. And Nikishin will be ready on day one, and I wholeheartedly believe that. If I'm wrong, I'll eat my hat. Scott Morrow, I think that if he continues developing in college the way that he's saying he wants to develop and everything, where he's worried about getting bigger, stronger, making himself better at quarterback in the power play and all that stuff, be potentially playing third pair minutes and learning to quarterback a power play, not having to spend any time at the American Hockey League level before doing so. As bad as it is that the Hurricanes don't have an affiliate at the American Hockey League or the ECHL level, it's not a good thing. It's not sustainable long-term, but it's not the end of the world, especially not considering where the Hurricanes have most of their prospects currently playing at. The Hurricanes also lost their ECHL affiliate as Norfolk Admirals entered an affiliation agreement with the Winnipeg Jets and the Manitoba Moose for this upcoming season. Okay, so disappointing for me personally, especially since I used to be stationed there and everything, and I like the Admirals. But it's not without explanation. ECHL guys, it's a development league, so they want to have somewhere to send their guys up and send them down. A lot of times they'll send them down to the SPHL, sometimes the FPHL, but more often than not the SPHL, and send them up to the AHL. So they needed to have that pipe there for the sake of player development so they could move one guy up and move another guy in. So this article came out shortly after what was said regarding the Norfolk Admirals changing affiliation, and that's what makes me think maybe this guy was just kind of trying to throw some oil on a fire that maybe wasn't that big to begin with, because nobody was really talking about this anymore, as he stated in the beginning of the article, and the Hurricanes have said that they have a plan. I made one of the first videos I ever made was about what the Hurricanes could potentially do with a new AHL franchise, and I think I'm going to do a follow-up to that because there's a bunch of intriguing ideas. I personally would love to see a team put in the triangle, but there's other options there, at least in the short term, that you can do. Young said that about 8 to 10 NHL teams have reached out so far to inquire about the Wolves taking on players from other NHL teams on loans in the 2023-24 season. The Wolves GM confirmed to InsideAHLHockey.com that he is willing to work with other NHL teams and take players on a case-by-case basis. So while they won't have any affiliation agreement with an NHL club during the 23-24 season, it's not out of the question that the Wolves will have NHL contracted players loaned to them by other NHL teams looking for an extra place to develop prospects if they are very deep at a certain position. So you might get the extra prospects that they have if they do have extra depth at a certain position. The Wolves would not be getting the best ones. So it's hard to put a team together of the best players available in a league when the best players available are constantly getting called up to the NHL, and the plan is that several of them develop into long-term pieces for their NHL franchise. So whatever the Wolves are planning to do here, I'm not entirely sure how sustainable it is, because they've had several different affiliates, Carolina included, over the past few years. So I'm not sure what their end game here is, but I'm going to get to another point about that here in a moment. It's not a good look for anyone. It's not a good look for the Chicago Wolves. It's not a good look for Carolina, the AHL, the NHL, Young said, of this situation getting to this point. While the narrative out there is that this is a bold and silly move on the Chicago Wolves' part, Young is standing firm by his word that this has a lot more to do with Carolina's change in how they approach their plans at the AHL level. We didn't make this decision, Young said, of the two sides parting ways with the Wolves and going it alone in 23-24, Carolina did by their actions. Okay, so starting off, regardless of the subject matter of the article, I have several criticisms about how this information was presented to begin with. Tony Androckitis, the guy who wrote this, he made absolutely no indication whatsoever that he intended to reach out to Carolina for comment, or that he had attempted to do so and was declined comment or received a comment in return. From what I saw on Twitter, he was basically saying, well, since the title has part 1 in it, that basically says I'm going to reach out to Carolina, and he has made absolutely no indication that he's attempted to or is intending to do so. So that's the first thing here. He only got one side of the story and published a part 1, which leads me to believe he put this article out specifically within a short time frame after the Norfolk Admirals made their announcement because he wanted to chase some clout, or maybe he thought it would make a compelling story. The way that this article is written, it seems more like creative writing than informative writing, in my opinion. That's the first thing. So the article can also be immediately interpreted as an attempt to lay blame on Carolina without getting the other side of the story just because of the aforementioned things. And also, if you notice, this guy had some advertisements on the page to contribute to his Patreon for $3 a month, so something tells me if there is a follow-up article to this, which he gives the indication that there will be, it's going to be one of those things that is maybe locked behind a paywall and you have to pay $3 to access it, and then bring them into an article that tells us maybe the same exact story but just from another perspective. This all looks very short-sighted to me so far. It could develop into something else, but that's just my current interpretation of it at the outset here. The other thing regarding wanting to be competitive but also developing prospects at the same time was something I touched on earlier. Going out there and losing every night almost has the exact same effect as going out and winning every night, and then you never face any adversity. So basically, if you're a team that wins all the time, you don't know how to lose, you don't know how to respond to losing, you don't know how to bounce back, you've never faced any adversity, and overconfidence and a lack of confidence are very close cousins. The prospects playing good competitive hockey is imperative to not only the success of the prospects as individuals and the big club, but also to the American Hockey League affiliate, especially one that's won 2 Calder Cups in the last 4 seasons like the Chicago Wolves have. So that's going to bring me to my next point, the difference between core players on an NHL team and core players on an AHL team. So, for example, when you think of the Hurricanes and someone says core players, who do you think of? Aho, Svechnikov, Slavin, Pesci, Kokaniemi, guys like that. They're your best players, but they're the ones who bring something to the table that you want to make decent investments in, that you want to have around for somewhere between like 4 to 7 seasons if possible, and of which all the guys I just mentioned there have been with the team longer than 4 seasons and appear to be staying long term, except maybe Pesci, but I'm still hoping he sticks around. When you think of the core of an NHL team that are signing 8-year contracts and looking to stay there long term, and then you add those supplementary pieces like the depth forward, the bottom pair defensemen, to enhance the lineup you build around those types of guys. In the AHL, considering the best players available are constantly up and down, and sometimes they get called up and they never go back. So, for example, there were 4 players on the 2019 Calder Cup Charlotte Checkers that were also on the 2022 Chicago Wolves Calder Cup winning team. That was Stelio Mattheos, Spencer Smallman, Andrew Podorowski, and Jesper Sellgren. The repeat names you're going to have on there are going to be the big names. And I'm not saying that these guys aren't good hockey players. If you get paid to play the game at all, you're good at it. They were not the stars of the team. Now, if you want to talk about these supplementary pieces, if you will, on those respective teams, each of the guys that I'm about to mention here had extensive NHL time at some point. They are currently in the NHL. Tomas Jurko, Stephen Lawrence, Clark Bishop, Nicolas Waugh, Morgan Geekie, Patrick Brown, Jake Bean, Hayden Fleury, Dustin Tokarski, Alex Nedeljkovic, Scott Darling, and a name you may be really familiar with, Martin Necas, were all on the 2019 club, and they were very critical to the 2019 club winning the Calder Cup, but none of them are there anymore. And all these guys have an extensive amount of NHL experience. Some of them are still playing in the NHL, some of them played in the NHL before. Now, if you look at the 2022 Calder Cup winning team, you're going to see some more familiar names. Josh Levo played in the NHL. Hurricanes signed him as a depth piece. He was there. Steph Nason, currently with the team for another season at least. Jack Drury, Jalen Chatfield, incredibly notable from that team, currently playing for the Hurricanes. Maxime Lajoie, Alex Lyon, and Pyotr Kochetkov, of course. Everyone knows that name now. In addition to that, you have 2 guys on that team that look like they could potentially crack the lineup as soon as this season, with Vasily Ponomarev and Jamison Reese. So the point I'm trying to make, when you're at the top and you have nowhere to go, the core pieces are your best and most valuable players in several different aspects of the game, if not all of them. Whereas your core players, those guys that tend to be there long term at the American Hockey League level, are great players, but they're guys that are probably not going to see a ton of, if any, NHL time at all. And then you try and get the best pieces that you can around them for however long they're going to be there before the big club calls them up. So if this is really going to be Chicago's philosophy, and if they do get players loaned out to them by other NHL teams, are they going to push back on them when they say they want to call a guy up, or when they say a guy's not getting enough minutes? I don't see how this is going to work for them. One of the reasons why I'm hoping the SPHL and the ECHL will start gaining more and more traction and getting more and more skilled players, because the skill levels of those leagues have increased drastically over the past few years. While having affiliations would still matter, they wouldn't be the end-all be-all. I would love to see the SPHL and the ECHL have so much parity in them that you could potentially see a guy get pulled directly out of those leagues and brought up to the NHL. Somebody sees a dark horse candidate develop and put him in a bigger role, and I would love to start seeing stuff like that. I don't think it's going to happen, at least not anytime soon, but that would mitigate a lot of things like this. Now, from the standpoint of the Hurricanes mitigating an issue like this happening again, the best thing they could do is just buy their own AHL team. Maybe Dundon can look into doing an aggressive takeover of the Checkers, something like that. To summarize my feelings on this article, 1, I think Tony Androckitis did a very poor job wording a lot of things in here. 2, I understand the desire and the difficulty of a minor league team, especially the one directly below the National Hockey League, to stay competitive, especially considering how reliant teams like that, even though you have streaming services nowadays like AHL TV, sometimes they'll be on local channel broadcasts, Flow Hockey, Hockey.tv, stuff like that, they're still heavily reliant on gate revenue, and the biggest factor driving gate revenue is always going to be if that team is winning or not. So I understand that side of it. For an AHL team to sustain long-term competitiveness, the way that I interpret it, they have to build around veteran AHL players, the best players that they can get that are not going to be called up. So I don't know if maybe Chicago is planning on limiting the number of prospects they're going to take on. I don't know if the Wolves are planning on limiting how many actual NHL contracts, how many actual two-way contracts that they're going to take on in favor of having a bunch of guys that are strictly under contract with the AHL franchise of the Chicago Wolves. So that's just my first video about this. I have a feeling I'm going to do more. I'm going to look into some of the American Hockey League teams that are also owned by their same NHL franchises. For example, the Toronto Marlies are owned by the Maple Leaf Sports Group. So that's going to be something that I look into in that regard. And I want to see maybe what the dynamic of something like that is versus a team that is still independently owned, operated, yet has a NHL affiliation, especially if they have a long one. I could maybe do a sample size along the lines of finding someone who's had a really long relationship, like the Capitals and the Hershey Bears, and some other teams that have maybe had a little bit shorter of a relationship, like, say, less than 5 years, and see what the differences seem to be there with how often guys get called up and everything like that. So that's just my whole thing with this article. I don't really feel like it lays the foundation to tell the whole story. So I'm going to give this a solid 2 out of 10 on the part of Tony Androckitis. Depending on how much of the truth is being told, I'm going to give Wendell Young a 3 out of 10 on this. It sounds like that he was asking for more power than he knew he would have, and he should have never entered into an agreement with the Hurricanes in the first place. And I find it funny that if he's wanted to have a competitive AHL franchise this whole time, that he has waited this long to go this route of going independent. That's all I've got for this video. If you guys like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, all that other good stuff. I will try to have the weekly show this week, and I'm sure that this topic will be revisited. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Y'all take care.